On a bright cold Tuesday in the fall of 1894, 40 wagon-loads of wet apple pomace were tipped into the lane of a widow named Dorcas Selm, and the man who ordered it done sat his horse at the head of that lane in a good black coat and watched every single load go over the tailboard, because he wanted her to see it, and he wanted the valley to see her seeing it. Pomace, if you have never stood downwind of a cider mill in October, is what is left of an apple after the press has had its way with it, the skins and the cores and the seeds and the stems and the broke-up pulp, wrung out flat and shoveled off in a wet brown mass that steams in the cold morning and goes sour in 3 days and draws every fly in the township. And the Kittery Mill on Rush Branch made better than 1,000 barrels of cider in a good year, and it made pomace by the wagon load every day of the pressing season, and in that valley pomace was not a product, pomace was a problem. A thing you hauled somewhere and got rid of, and hoped the wind was not out of the south when you did it. Rulon Kittery owned that mill and owned the pressing rights on half the orchards in the valley, and he had been hauling his pomace 2 miles to a gully on his own back ground for 11 years, and on that Tuesday he quit doing that, and instead his teams came down the Rush Branch Road one behind the other and turned in at the low gate of the 3-acre place at the bottom of the hollow where Dorcas Selm had lived alone for 9 years, and they dumped, and they went back for more, and they dumped again, from a little after daylight until the middle of the afternoon, until there was a heap of wet sour apple waste in that woman's lane taller than the roof of her own smokehouse and near as long as the lane itself. There were men watching from the road by noon, because a thing like that gets around a valley faster than a fire. And when Rulon Kittery finally turned his horse to go home, he said the line that the whole valley repeated for the next 2 months, that the widow had told him her lot was worth more to her than money, and he had come around to agreeing with her, and that he was pleased to see her finally getting some use out of it. And they laughed. Not all of them, but enough of them, and the ones who did not laugh did not say anything either, which in a small valley amounts to about the same thing. Now you need to know who those 2 people were, because nothing after this makes any sense unless you do. Dorcas Selm was 62 years old that fall, a short, heavy-shouldered woman with a face the weather had been working on since she was a girl. Iron-gray hair pulled back so tight it made her look severe when she was only tired, and she wore the same patched brown wool skirt and the same dull yellow shawl 6 days a week and a black one on Sunday. And she was not a handsome woman, and had never been one, and had never once in her life given the matter 10 minutes of thought. Her husband, Ansel Selm, had been a mill hand and a cooper's helper, and had died 9 years back of a thing in his chest that the doctor in town called by 3 different names in one winter, and he had left her 3 acres at the bottom of the hollow, a 2-room house, a smokehouse, a hand pump, a good cold spring that ran out of the hillside behind the house and never failed in any August, and no money at all. She kept a garden. She took in washing from 2 families up on the ridge. She sold eggs and horseradish and sauerkraut in a basket at the crossroads store, and by every measure a bank or a neighbor ever used. She was the poorest full-grown property owner on the Rush Branch Road, and every man in that valley could have told you so without stopping to think about it. Rulon Kittery was 51 and was not poor, and the difference showed in 100 small ways, in the black coat and the watch chain across his waistcoat and the clean hands, and the fact that he had a man to hold his horse. He had built the Rush Branch Mill up from his father's little screw press into the biggest cider works in that end of the county, and he was not, whatever you might be building up in your head about him right now, a wicked man in the ordinary run of things. He paid what he said he would pay. He gave work in the pressing season to more men than anybody else in the valley, and he had carried 3 families through a bad winter on credit at his own store. He was only certain. He was certain of what a thing was worth, and he was certain of who he was dealing with, and those 2 certainties, put together in one man with money, will do more harm in a small country than plain meanness ever managed. The trouble between them was the spring lot. The cold spring behind the Selm house came out of the hillside at a good steady flow and ran down through her 3 acres and into Rush Branch just above the mill, and Rulon Kittery had wanted that ground for 2 years, because his pressing season ran his own mill pond low every October, and a fed spring lot above him would have carried him through. And he had come to her twice with an offer, and she had said no both times. The second time on her own porch with her hands in her apron, saying only that her husband had walled that spring with his own hands, and she did not care to sell water. He offered again in September, and she said no again, and he asked her what she thought the lot was worth to her, and she said more than money. And he took that answer the way certain men take any answer that is not the one they came for, as a kind of insolence that would want correcting. He was within his rights in the letter of it. The Kittery teams had a hauling road easement down the Rush Branch Road, and her lane joined it. And the law in that county in those years had nothing much to say about where a man put his own mill waste so long as he did not put it in running water. And he was careful not to put it in running water. He put it in her lane, and when a lawyer in town told her a week later that she could bring a nuisance suit and that it would cost her $40 to start and take 2 years, and that Rulon Kittery had never in his life lost a case in that courthouse, she thanked the lawyer and paid him $1 for his time and walked the 4 miles home, and by then the heap in her lane had been sitting 11 days and had gone from sour to something considerably worse than sour, and there were men driving out of their way to come look at it. She started hauling it the morning after she got back from town, and this is the part the valley never forgot. The part that people who were children then still described the same way 60 years later. She did not have a horse. She had a wheelbarrow with a cracked wheel, and she had a hay rope and 2 feed sacks sewed together, and she had her own back. And every morning that fall she went out to that heap with a fork and loaded. And when the barrow bogged in the mud, she filled the great sewn sack instead and roped it across her chest and shoulders and carried it. And a wet load of pomace in a sack that size will run better than 80 pounds. And it rides low and it rides forward, so that what the valley saw for 6 straight weeks, every time anybody drove the Rush Branch Road, was a short, heavy old woman in a faded yellow shawl bent nearly double under a bundle bigger than she was, walking it 100 yards up her own lane to the flat ground behind her smokehouse and setting it down and going back for another. Men counted her trips out loud at the store. Somebody figured she was moving 3 tons a week, and somebody else said it could not be that much, and they argued about the number, and not one of them argued about whether it was a sad thing to watch. Her neighbor's boy, a lanky 16-year-old named Wick Barrow, whose mother took in sewing the way Dorcas took in washing, came down on the 4th day and started forking beside her without being asked and without saying much, and when Rulon Kittery heard about it, he made a remark at the store about hiring a boy to move garbage, and Wick's mother heard the remark. And Wick went right on going down there every morning, and that is worth remembering because it is the first place in this story where the valley started to split. And now I am going to tell you the end of it before I tell you the middle, because the middle is better once you know, and because you did not come here to be strung along. 88 days after the last of those 40 wagons tipped in her lane, on the 10th of January, 1895, a buyer for a wholesale grocery house out of the county seat stood in a lean-to shed behind that widow's smokehouse, drew a sample off a cracked barrel, tested it with the little glass apparatus he carried in his coat, and wrote Dorcas Selm a draft for $3,740, and then read the figure out loud in the lane in front of the depot agent and 2 teamsters, the way buyers closed a thing in front of witnesses in those days. $3,740 in 1895 was more than 4 full years of wages for a good farmhand. It was more than the Crossroads store took in over a whole winter. It was. And every man standing in that cold lane did this arithmetic inside of about 4 seconds, roughly what Rulon Kittery's entire mill cleared in a season. And every dollar of it had come out of the stuff Rulon Kittery had paid his own men with his own teams to haul down that lane and throw away. Now here is how she did it, and there is no luck anywhere in it, and no secret either, and that is the part that ought to bother you. Here is what nobody on that road knew, and what Rulon Kittery in particular had no way in the world of guessing. Dorcas Selm had not been born in that valley. She had come from a German settlement in Pennsylvania where her mother and her mother's people had made cider vinegar for the wholesale trade for 2 generations, and she had grown up in a vinegar house, and she knew, in her hands and not out of a book, the one thing that made that stinking heap in her lane worth more than the mill it came from. And I want to lay it out plain, because it is not complicated, and because the whole rest of this story is only the working out of it. When the press squeezes an apple, it does not get all the sugar. It cannot. The press takes the free juice, and it leaves the pulp, and that wrung-out pulp still holds somewhere between 1/5 and 1/4 of the fruit's sugar locked up in the wet mass. And a cider maker cannot get at it because his business is speed. He wants clear juice in a barrel and the pomace off his floor before it sours on him. But sour is exactly the direction you want to be going if you are not making cider. You are making vinegar. And vinegar is made in 2 steps, not 1. First, the sugar turns to alcohol, which yeast will do all by itself in any warm crock without a soul helping it, and then the alcohol turns to acetic acid, which is vinegar, and that second turn is done by a different little working thing altogether, the vinegar mother. And what the mother needs is not sugar, it is air. Air and warmth and time and a great deal of surface. That is the whole secret. And it is why vinegar was a rich man's manufacture in the cities and a nobody's manufacture in the country. Because the men in the cities had figured out that if you trickle the alcohol slow down through a tall barrel packed loose with beech shavings with air holes bored round the bottom, the liquid spreads out over miles of wet wood surface and meets air the whole way down, and what took 6 months in a crock takes 11 days in that barrel. Her mother had run 12 such barrels in a shed in Pennsylvania. Dorcas Selm had climbed them as a child to change the shavings. So what she was carrying up her lane on her back was not garbage. It was, if you knew the trade, about 11 tons of unfermented sugar that a mill had been paying men to throw away for 11 years, and she had the water to wash it with, a cold spring that never failed. And she had the wood for shavings on her own hillside, and she had her mother's mother in a stone crock on a shelf. A gray, slick living pad of vinegar mother that had come from Pennsylvania in a covered wagon and had been fed and kept alive on that shelf for 9 years for no reason at all except that you do not throw away your mother's mother. What she did not have was barrels, and barrels were the wall she had to get over, because a cooper's barrel new made cost $1.80 in that county in 1894, and she needed 40 of them, and she had, that October, $11 in change. So she went to Enoch Bray, the cooper at the crossroads, an old man who had worked with her husband years back, and she did not ask him for charity. And this is the kind of thing that tells you who she was. She asked him what he did with his culls. Every cooper has culls, barrels that come out slack or split at a chime or refused by a buyer, and Bray had a shed and a fence line full of them and had been burning them a load at a time for years, and she offered him 4 cents apiece for every cull he had and every one he made, and she offered to take them in any condition and to bring her own wagon, meaning the boy and the barrow, and Enoch Bray looked at her a while and sold her 62 of them for a lump $2 and told her to come back in the spring for the rest. A slack barrel that will not hold cider will hold beech chips perfectly well. A barrel split at the top chime is exactly the barrel you want, because you have to bore air holes in it anyway. And I want you to picture the winter honestly, because there is a version of this story where a clever woman thinks of something and gets rich, and that version is a lie. What actually happened is 11 weeks of the worst work in that valley done by the oldest person doing it. Washing pomace in January means standing over a wooden trough with your sleeves rolled and your hands in spring water that comes out of a hillside at 50 degrees and does not get any warmer, hour after hour, forking the wet mass in and raking it out, and her hands cracked open across the knuckles the first week and stayed that way until March. And Wick Barrow's mother sent down mutton tallow twice and a pair of her dead husband's gloves that were far too big and got used anyway. The lean-to had to be kept warm because the mother will not work cold, so the little stove ran day and night and had to be fed at 2 in the morning, and Dorcas Selm got up and fed it at 2 in the morning for 61 nights running. And on the coldest of those nights she slept on the lean-to floor beside it, wrapped in a horse blanket, rather than trust it to hold till daylight. Beech shavings do not come off a hillside by themselves either, and that meant a boy and an old woman felling and bucking and draw-knifing beech on a frozen slope in December for weeks to fill 100 and some barrels loose to the top, and boring the air holes in 62 culled barrels with a brace and bit, 4 holes to a barrel, by hand, is a job that will take the skin off a palm. Nobody drove out to watch that part. They had all watched the sad part in the lane in October and gone home satisfied with what they had seen, and not one of them came back in January to see what the sad part had turned into, which is a thing about people that has not changed one bit since. She worked all of November and most of December in a lean-to she and wick barrow built off the south side of the smokehouse where the sun struck, washing the pomace in spring water in a wooden trough, running the sweet wash into crocks and then into the culled barrels, keeping the lean-to warm with a little stove Wick's mother sent down, packing the tall barrels with beech shavings off her own hill, and setting the mother to work in the first one on the 11th of November. And on the 10th of January, 1895, Josiah Pell, who bought for a wholesale grocery house out of the county seat and came through that valley twice a year, stood in a widow's lean-to in the cold and drew off a sample from a slack barrel and tasted it and then tested it properly with the little glass apparatus he carried and found it running better than 5.5% acid, which is above the strength the trade called for, clean and clear and apple bright, and he asked her how much she had, and she showed him, and he counted. And he did his figuring on the back of an order pad while she waited with her hands in her apron. He bought her whole run at the Cincinnati wholesale price, less freight, which came to $3,740, and because he had no such money in his coat, he wrote her a draft on the house, and he handed it to her in the lane, and then, because the depot agent and 2 teamsters and the cooper's grandson were standing right there in the cold, having come to watch the buyer's rig, he read the figure out loud, the way buyers did in those days to close a thing in front of witnesses, $3,740 to Mrs. Dorcas Selm for Vinegar. The depot agent asked him to say it again. He said it again. And Dorcas Selm folded the draft in half and put it in her apron pocket and asked Josiah Pell whether his house would want the same quantity again in the spring, which is the only question she asked him the entire morning, and he said his house would want 4 times it if she could make it, and she said she could. The news beat the buyer's rig back up the Rush Branch Road. That is not a figure of speech. That is how those valleys worked, and by the following Sunday there was not a household in 9 miles that had not heard the number, and the number is the thing that did it. Because a story about a widow being clever is only a story, and a figure read out loud in a lane in front of a depot agent is a fact, and facts travel differently. What the valley did with that fact was not what you might expect. There was no cheering and nobody organized anything. What there was a quiet and rather terrible refiguring going on in about 200 heads at once, because every orchard man on that branch had been hauling his own small pomace out to a gully for his whole life, and every one of them now sat down at his own kitchen table and worked out on the back of a feed bill roughly what his own gully had cost him, and the answers they got were not comfortable answers. And Rulon Kittery, who had 11 years of pomace lying in a gully on his back ground and a pressing season starting again in 9 months, made the single worst decision of his life, which was to try to fix it fast. He sent word down the hollow by his foreman that in view of the changed circumstances, the mill would in future be selling its pomace rather than giving it away, and that he was prepared to let Mrs. Selm have it at $1.25 the wagon load as a neighborly figure, and the foreman came back and reported, in front of 2 men at the mill office, that the widow had thanked him, and said she believed she was supplied. And she was. That is the part Kittery had not thought through in his hurry. She had 11 tons in the yard already, and it does not spoil once it is washed and working. She had the whole valley's small orchards now falling over themselves to bring her theirs for nothing just to be part of it, and she had Ansel's cousin's press. A little screw press in a shed 6 miles off that had not turned in a decade, which she bought outright in February for $90, so that after that spring she did not even need a mill. Rulon Kittery had spent 11 years being the only man in the valley who could turn apples into money, and in one January he had personally, at his own expense, with his own teams, taught the valley that the leavings were worth more than the juice. Now here is where I have to slow down, because what Dorcas Selm did in the next 4 years is the actual story, and the January draft was only the door into it. She did not move out of the 2-room house. She never did, not in her life, and 40 years later, people still remarked on it. What she bought with that first money was 120 more culled barrels from Enoch Bray at his own asking price this time. A proper vinegar house, 40 feet by 20, framed by 2 carpenters from the county seat and roofed before the 1st of May, and a second-hand grading and testing outfit so she would never again have to take a buyer's word for the strength of her own product. And she hired Wick Barrow at a man's wage, though he was 17, and she hired 2 widows off the ridge. Women who had been taking in washing the same as she had, and she paid them by the week and not by the piece, and by the end of that first summer, the Vinegar House on the Selm Place was the 3rd largest employer of labor on the Rush Branch Road. In the second season, working her own press and the pomace of 11 orchards, she made and sold $9,260 of cider vinegar, and Josiah Pell's house took every gallon and asked for more and wrote her a standing contract, and in the 3rd season she went past 14,000 and stopped taking the whole of the valley's pomace because she could not handle it, and told the men who brought it where else to sell it, which is a thing worth stopping on. She could have had a monopoly on the leavings of that valley for the asking. Instead, she told a Rush Branch orchard man in her own yard, in front of others, that Vinegar wanted competition, or the buyers would set the price, and that he ought to build his own tall barrels, and she showed him how. She showed anybody how. She would stand in that vinegar house with the doors open and explain the chips and the air holes and the trickle and the mother to any man or woman who came and asked. And a good number came, and by 1899 there were 9 vinegar houses on that branch and its feeders, and the Rush Branch Valley, which had been a place that sold cider cheap to a broker in the fall and had nothing. Coming in from January to June, was selling barreled vinegar the year round at a steady price, and the man from the wholesale house was coming through 4 times a year instead of 2. The county fair at the seat put in a class for manufactured vinegars in 1898, which it had never had. And the reason it had never had one is that until then there had been nothing in that county to put in it, and the first year that class was judged there were 14 entries, and 11 of them came off the Rush Branch and its feeders, and the judge. A chemist the state sent down wrote in his report that the strength and clarity of the entries from that one small valley were above anything he had tested outside of a city works, and the county paper printed the report entire, because a county paper will print anything that makes the county look like it knows something. The railroad noticed before the newspaper did, the way railroads do. The agent at the branch depot had been loading 4 or 5 cars a year out of that valley in the cider season, and nothing at all the rest of the time, and by '99 he was loading barreled vinegar in some quantity and every month of the calendar, including February, and he rode up the branch for a second weekly stop and got it. And that second stop did more for the farmers on that road over the next 20 years than the vinegar itself did, because a second stop moves everything: eggs and hay and butter and a man's own self when he needs to get to town, and not one of those farmers had done a thing to earn it except quit burning what they used to burn. And through all of it Dorcas Selm charged the going rate, kept her books in a school tablet, tested every barrel she shipped with her own apparatus, so that in 31 years of trading with that wholesale house not one lot of hers was ever refused for strength, and turned down, twice, offers from a Cincinnati concern to buy her name, and her contracts outright. The second offer being for a sum that a woman who had carried pomace on her back could have retired on 3 times over, and she gave the same reason both times, which was that the men on that branch had built their houses on her word that the buyer would keep coming, and a name sold to a city concern is a word sold with it. And there is a plainer thing under all of it that I want you to have, because it is the part that outlasts the money. Every one of those 9 Vinegar houses was built on material that had been costing its owners money to get rid of. Not one of them required a new orchard, a new acre, a new tree, or a single thing the valley did not already have and was already throwing away. The whole enterprise, from a widow's lane to 9 houses in 5 years, was the valley learning to stop paying to destroy its own second harvest. And the second harvest had been there the entire time. It was there when Rulon Kittery's father ran the screw press. It was there in every one of the 11 years the Kittery teams drove 2 miles to that gully. It cost nothing to see and everything to not see, and the only reason anybody in that valley ever did see it was that a man with money decided to humiliate a woman without any, and dump the evidence in her lane where she could get at it. Rulon Kittery did not take it well, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, because the true version of this is better than the tidy one. For most of 2 years he was hard about it. He raised his pressing charge on the orchards that hauled their pomace to her, and when 3 of them went and pressed at a mill in the next township instead, he had to take the charge back down, and it cost him more to take it down than it had ever gained him to put it up. He said things at the store. He said the vinegar trade was a fad and that the wholesale price would break, and the wholesale price did not break, and he said she had got the mother out of his own mill and owed him for it, which was not true, and which he stopped saying after Enoch Bray asked him quietly in front of 6 men whether he had ever in his life kept a crock alive on a shelf for 9 years. And underneath the hardness there was the plain accounting fact that he was now buying back, at a price, ground he had once had for nothing, because his pomace was worth money now, and the men who grew the apples knew it, and his margin on a barrel of cider was thinner every year of the 4. The thing that finally turned him was not the money. It was his own boy. Rulon Kittery had a son, Abel, who was 19 in that first winter, and who had driven one of the 40 wagons himself, and Abel had stood in that lane on the 10th of January and heard Josiah Pell read the figure out loud, and something in a 19-year-old sets that day and does not unset. Abel Kittery went to work for the widow in the spring of 1897, and did it in the open, walking down the Rush Branch Road past his father's mill office every morning at 6, and there is not a thing in this world that will take the certainty out of a man faster than watching his own son choose the other lane, every morning, for a year, without ever once arguing with him about it. He came down in the fall of '98. He came alone and on foot, which for Rulon Kittery was itself the whole speech, and he stood at the low gate at the bottom of the hollow, at the exact spot his teams had tipped their loads 4 years before, and he waited until she came out. He did not make it graceful. He said he had come to ask her to press at his mill again, which was true, and was also not the reason he had come. And she let him get all the way through the business part of it standing at the gate, and then he took his hat off and said the rest, that he had put that heap in her lane to shame her in front of the valley, that he had known exactly what he was doing when he did it and had enjoyed it at the time, and that he had been 49 years in that valley thinking he knew what things were worth and had been the last man on the branch to find out he could not tell waste from wages. And then he asked her, since he was already down there, and it could not get much worse, whether she would show him how to build the tall barrels, because his mill had a floor and a stove, and 11 years of pomace still lying in a gully on his background. And Dorcas Selm, who had carried 3 tons a week of his contempt up her own lane on her back at 62 years of age, looked at him a minute and said that the gully stuff was too far gone to be worth washing, and that he should let the boy handle the chips, because the boy already knew, and she opened the gate. She was not a saint about it, and I would not want to leave you with that. She charged him. She sold him the plans and the first mother and 2 weeks of Wick Barrow's time for $110, and she made him sign for it. And when he tried to make a joke about the widow's terms, she did not laugh and did not soften it, and he paid, and afterward he said to more than one person that he was glad she had charged him, because a gift would have sat on him the rest of his life. They were never friends. They were the thing a country valley respects a good deal more than friends, which is two people who settled it and then did business straight for 20 years. And when his mill and her vinegar house between them made the Rush Branch Valley the biggest cider vinegar shipping point on that division of the railroad in 1902. Neither one of them made a speech about it. Abel Kittery ran his father's mill from 1904 and ran it with a vinegar house attached from the first year, and he told the story about the 40 wagon loads himself, out loud, at agricultural meetings, all his life, and always in the same way that his father had once given away the best asset he ever owned, because he could not smell anything but the smell. Dorcas Selm kept working until she was 81. She never married again, she never bought a bigger house, she never in her life owned a carriage. And she wore the same sort of patched brown skirt and the same yellow shawl at 75 that she had worn under a sack of pomace at 62. And when the county historical people came out in 19 and 11 to write her up, she told them there was nothing to write. That she had not invented one single thing. That every bit of it had been done in Pennsylvania before she was born and done better, and that all she had ever done was be poor enough to look hard at what everybody else was hauling off. What she did do with the money over 30 years was quiet and steady and mostly went unremarked at the time. She carried 19 families through the Panic of 19 and 7 on her own books. She paid the freight for any orchard man on that branch who wanted to ship a first trial barrel of his own. She bought Wick Barrow's mother's place out of foreclosure in '99 and sold it back to Wick for what she paid, and Wick Barrow ran the Selm Vinegar House for 31 years and his own for 11 after that. She left the 3 acres and the spring and the vinegar house to a young woman named Effie Trant, who had come to her at 19 out of a Ridge family with nothing. The way Dorcas Selm had once come down out of a Pennsylvania vinegar shed with nothing, and Effie Trant ran it until 1946. And the spring lot, the cold-walled spring that Ansel Selm built with his own hands and that this whole story started over, never was sold. Not to Rulon Kittery, not to his son, not to anybody, and it is still walled and still running today, and the stone is still square. Now I want to say the thing this is really about, because it is not about apples, and it is not even, in the end, about a mean trick played on a poor woman in 1894. Everything Dorcas Selm made came out of material that was free, in her lane, in her hands, and already paid for by somebody else's disgust. The pomace was not rare. There was no secret in it and no luck in it, and there was nothing in that lane that 11 years of Kittery teamsters had not looked directly at twice a day all through every pressing season and smelled and shoveled and hated. The whole difference between a fortune and a nuisance in this story is that one woman had been taught by a mother who was taught by hers to ask what is still in this before I throw it out, and everybody else in the valley had been taught to ask, how far do I have to haul it? That is the entire distance between them. And I would like you to sit with the uncomfortable half of that, because the flattering half is easy. The flattering half is that a poor old widow was smarter than a rich man, and we all like that story and we have all heard it 100 times. The uncomfortable half is that Rulon Kittery was not a fool and was not a villain. He was a competent, hard-working, respected man who ran the best business in his valley for 11 years, and he threw away, personally, with his own teams, at his own cost, something on the order of $100,000. Because it looked like garbage and smelled like garbage, and everyone he knew agreed it was garbage. He was not blinded by greed. He was blinded by consensus. Every man he respected was throwing the same thing away, and that is a far stronger blindfold than greed ever was, and there is no reason on God's earth to think you and I are wearing a thinner one. So here is what I would like from you tonight. Look at the thing you throw out. Not the thing you have thought about and decided against, the thing you have never once thought about at all. Because everybody around you throws it out too, and it has always been carried off in the back of the wagon, and nobody in your whole life has ever asked why. In that valley it was apple pulp. In the tanneries it was spent bark, and a man in Ohio got rich on that. In the sawmills it was slabs and sawdust, and somebody got rich on that. On your own place, in your own trade, in your own kitchen, in your own week, there is something going out the back door every day that has a second harvest still in it, and the only reason you cannot see it is that you learned what waste was from people who were guessing. That is all Dorcas Selm ever had over anybody. She had a mother who taught her that the second turn is where the money is, and she had a lane full of it, and she was poor enough that she had to look. So tell me, down in the comments, what got thrown away where you come from? What did the mill, or the mine, or the mill town, or the cannery, or the packing house in your county hall often burn for years before somebody figured out it was worth something? Because every part of this country has one of those, and I would honestly rather read those than anything else all week. And tell me which of the two you would have been that Tuesday on the Rush Branch Road. The man on the horse who was certain, or the boy who picked up a fork and started forking without being asked. And be honest about it, because most of us are neither one. Most of us are the third kind, the ones who stood at the road and did not laugh, and also did not say anything. Next time I want to tell you about a widow on the far side of that same county who bought every load of spent tan bark the leather works would give her for nothing, 11 years of it, stacked in a field where the whole town could see it and say what they liked, and what a nurseryman from the city offered her for that field in the spring of 1901. And if this one got to you, send it on to somebody who has been laughed at for keeping something everybody else was in a hurry to burn. Down at the bottom of the hollow on the Rush Branch Road, an hour before dark, a short, heavy old woman in a faded yellow shawl walks out to the Vinegar house with a lantern to check the barrels, the way she has every evening for 30 years. And she lays her hand flat on the head of the oldest one and feels the warmth come up through the oak, the sugar still turning, the second harvest still working. In a barrel a cooper threw away. In a lane a rich man filled with garbage. On the poorest 3 acres in the valley, and she says nothing at all about it, and she goes in.